When D.W. Griffith chose Mary Pickford to play a damsel in distress in his 1912 film Beast at Bay, she was still an unknown actress. Though Griffith was experimenting with bolder ways of making movies, he was no better known in 1912 than Little Mary. During the next few years, Mary Pickford became so popular a star she was called America's Sweetheart. In the early teens, Griffith directed dozens of short films, growing more ambitious, perfecting his technique. Griffith's next great film was Hearts of the World, a story of the Great War in Europe. Griffith made a number of films to promote the Allied war effort and served as chairman of the Motion Picture War Service Association. For his contributions to the war effort, he was decorated by the War Department. Hollywood producers and directors made dozens of propaganda films during the war years. One producer, Stuart Blackton, filmed scenes for his film The Battle Cry of Peace in Central Park. Movie stars, too, joined the war effort. Mary Pickford sold war bonds at rallies in New York and Washington. Douglas Fairbanks joined her in the patriotic appeal. Even the aging actress Sarah Bernhardt made public appearances to help raise money for the war. Some stars, like Charlie Chaplin, made their appeals in person and on film. Buy bonds to beat the Hun. America was an industrial giant. The evidence was everywhere, and nowhere more than in our cities. New bridges and taller buildings were changing our skylines. Grand Central Station opened in 1913. In the big cities, skyscrapers were the symbols of progress and achievement. In 1912, F.W. Woolworth began building a skyscraper in New York, which would be known as the Cathedral of Commerce. At 58 stories, it towered over Manhattan. And when it opened the next year, it was the tallest office building in the world. The greatest engineering achievement of the era was the Panama Canal. Begun under President Roosevelt, its construction had spanned the administrations of 3 presidents. For more than a decade, 500,000 men worked to complete its 50 miles of locks and waterways at a cost of nearly $400 million. When the first ships passed through the canal in 1914, they made the trip between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in hours rather than days. To celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal, an international fair was built in San Francisco at a cost of nearly $50 million. It was the Panama Pacific Exposition. When it opened in 1915, 26 nations were represented. It provided an impressive panorama of technology and human progress. When most of us thought about progress in technology, we meant the automobile. By 1914, Americans had bought more than 500,000 cars, most of them Fords. When Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line in 1913, he reduced the time it took to assemble an automobile from 14 hours to 93 minutes, and he revolutionized industrial production. Ford's methods of production were quickly applied to other industries, increasing our ability to produce more goods faster and at lower cost. It seemed to many that America had become an industrial giant almost overnight. We took these remarkable capabilities and turned them to the weapons of war. We took the automobile and armored it for battle. We took our trucks and learned to make them bigger and stronger, and we built tanks. And we made guns, big and small, cannon and rifles by the thousand, shells, mortars, grenades, and mines. We made the planes that would carry our flyers across the lines to crush the enemy. Bayonets, parachutes, gas masks, and boots. Ships were built of wood and steel. For food and clothing by the 100-ton must go to France as well. And into glorious battle. Here in the trenches, where a generation of men of all nations would die. Battlefields were littered with soldiers whose bodies no longer knew night or day, rain or sun. And here, when night fell on the living, rats crawled among the trenches. Here, at Armageddon. Before his death in the Great War, one soldier, Wilfred Owen, wrote these lines. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once at home, whispering of fields unsown. Always it woke him even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Why did we fight? For glory? Or for gain? For wealth? Or profit? And at what cost? We fought in the name of freedom, but the sight of waving flags and the sound of solemn hymns and rousing marches were far away, and they seemed so long ago. 10 million men were dead. Concerns were with the war. We had wheatless days and meatless days to ensure enough food for the boys. We bought Liberty Bonds and continued to roll bandages for the Red Cross. And we continued to send letters to fathers and brothers, husbands and sons still in France. Our children were too young to fight, but we wondered if they too might someday have to go to war. With strength and courage, we continued to build for the future, convinced that the war could not last much longer. And then, in the 11th month, on the 11th day, at the 11th hour, Germany surrendered. Out of the trenches, into the open. Axis troops and allies could again be men. It had been a bitter struggle. It was over. Our men were coming home. The Army, the Navy, and the Marines. The infantry and the cavalry. Home to their wives, mothers, sweethearts. The Red Cross, which had served so valiantly, now helped in the joyous task of welcoming the boys. In cities and towns all across the land, thousands, then 100,000s, then millions joined in the celebration. And for each of the headlines which proclaimed Germany surrenders, there were banners which read, "Where's the Kaiser now?" Or simply, "I told you so." In Boston and New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Atlanta, in Kansas and Oklahoma, Delaware and Montana, the shouts rang out and sirens joined with church bells proclaiming not disaster, but victory. In New York, one observer noted, "It was enough to walk the streets with 10,000 strangers and to realize that in that moment of good news, not one of them was really a stranger." At this moment in history, democracy was supreme. Within a month of the armistice, President Wilson left for Europe as head of the American peace delegation. He was welcomed in London by King George and the grateful people of Britain. Wilson carried with him his plan for peace, a peace without victory which he hoped would make possible a world without war. The peace conference was held in Paris, and the French received the American president as the savior of Western civilization. He called his plan for peace the 14 points. After weeks of heated debate, the treaty was signed at the Palace of Versailles in the Great Hall of Mirrors. Despite the compromises required to secure the agreement of the Allied powers, Wilson was pleased that the Versailles Treaty included his 14th point, for it provided for a League of Nations, and the League was the heart of Wilson's peace plan. As he left France and sailed home to America, exhausted from his efforts, he was unaware of the resistance he would meet when he presented the treaty to Congress for ratification. For America was weary of war, tired of idealistic talk of noble sacrifice. Many were unwilling to honor the commitments Wilson had made in Paris. As opposition mounted to the treaty and the League, Wilson appealed to the people. On his cross-country campaign, his speeches were among the greatest of his career, so moving that people wept openly at his words. But Wilson collapsed and was taken back to the White House. A stroke 4 days later left him paralyzed. But by now, Americans had other concerns. Thousands had died in France, and hundreds of thousands were now dying at home of influenza. It was a worldwide epidemic that had already swept Europe, and many believed it was another result of the war. By the spring of 1919, 500,000 Americans were dead, 6 times the number of American soldiers who had died in France. And fear was in the air. A series of violent strikes that year fed our fears. So did the words of radicals and socialists like Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, and Eugene Debs. Millions worried that America was on the brink of revolution. Communists had overthrown the Russian Tsar in the Bolshevik Revolution 2 years earlier. Now, communist uprisings in Bavaria and Hungary made us wonder whether Western civilization would be swallowed by Bolshevism. America was in the grip of the Red Scare. 1919 was also the year of anarchist bombings. One anarchist was killed while bombing the house of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The Palmer raids began in November. Thousands of radicals were arrested. Hundreds were deported. America had been ravaged by controversy, war, epidemic, and fear. President Woodrow Wilson spent his final months in the White House as an invalid, supported and protected by his devoted wife, Edith. When he was told of the final defeat of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, he asked to be read a passage from the Bible. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed.